Got a very exciting show, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, a 5-year journey in search of the unknown, a wild story from Nick Redfern, and Jim Mars is fascinated with it, which is why in a couple of minutes he's going to be interviewing Nick. For our subscribers, I'm going to be talking to Nick also about a sighting of an enormous bird I had in Coscob, Connecticut in 1979 while outdoors with my little then newborn child. A harrowing experience I have never forgotten. Nick knows a lot about this and what happened and what it may have meant. Here on Dreamland, in a couple of minutes, Jim is going to be talking to Nick Redfern about monster hunting. Now, before he does that, there are some terrific things you need to know about this book. Like one of our frequent Dreamland guests, Marie Jones, author of Science and Supervolcano, says Memoirs of a Monster Hunter is a wild and woolly 5-year odyssey into the unknown, courtesy of one of the premier investigative researchers and authors in the field. And that is so true. Having had the pleasure of interviewing Nick before, I am excited. This is going to be a terrific experience. Nick is a full-time author and journalist. He specializes in unsolved mysteries, monsters, alien abductions, government conspiracies. He writes for the Daily Express in England. He writes for the Fortean Times, Fate, for UFO magazines. His previous books, Strange Secrets, Cosmic Crashes, which I believe we talked about on Dreamland, Three Men Seeking Monsters. So I would like to welcome what I think is going to be a phenomenal interview with guest host Jim Mars and Dreamland guest Nick Redfern. Gentlemen, welcome both of you to Dreamland. How are you doing, Jim?
Thank you, Whitley. Yes, I'm looking forward to this discussion with Nick Redfern because I've known Nick for some time now and know him to be a responsible and dedicated researcher. Nick, it's great to have you with us today. You're speaking from your new home in Dallas, right?
That's right, Jim, and thanks for that introduction, Whitley. That's very much appreciated. That's right. Excuse me. I've been in the U.S. for 6 years and in Texas throughout that entire period. My wife's from just outside the town of Beaumont, and we originally lived just outside Houston and been back and forth, and the last couple of years been in Dallas. So that's where our home is right now.
Well, you remind me of the bumper sticker said, I was not born in Texas, but I got here as quick as I could. And you're welcome to be here, and I'm glad to have somebody of your caliber in this area. Before we jump into some of the really interesting narratives of your book, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, let me start off by asking you, Nick, because I've known you for your diligent research into UFOs and into government documents, into, things that seem to be pretty solid. What was it that stirred you to go in search of monsters?
Well, actually, it goes back quite a long time. I mean, I'm 42 now, and my interest actually went back to when I was about 5 years old, around about 1969, and my parents took me to Loch Ness. And, of course, we all know what's alleged to live in Loch Ness, the Loch Ness Monster. And, even at that age, when my parents, or my father specifically, I think it was, told me that the tale of, how there was this supposedly still living dinosaur or some sort of weird creature lurking deep within Loch Ness, that really, even at that age, spurred my interest in weird phenomena, shall we say. And I guess, the idea of this spooky, large, fog-shrouded loch, the idea that this creature could exist in there, got me interested. And I suppose when a lot of the other kids at school were reading British equivalents of things like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries, I was reading about Bigfoot, werewolves, and lake monsters. And I think that's really what kicked off my interest, was that defining moment of going to Loch Ness. And ever since then, really, my twin passions as far as the unexplained are concerned have been UFOs and weird creatures.
One thing tends to lead to another. Well, let me ask you, based on your research, what are your personal thoughts on the Loch Ness Monster? What's happening here?
Well, a lot of people who are openly skeptical of the subject often make comments like, well, Britain's not a very big country. The entire nation is actually smaller than the state of Texas. And people say, well, how could something like the Loch Ness Monster remain hidden in Loch Ness and not be found discovered or at least determined what it is. People don't necessarily realise until they get there exactly how big Loch Ness is. I mean, it's 22 miles long, a mile wide. At its deepest point, it's almost 1,000 feet deep, and the water is literally pitch black. And so, the idea that if this creature is a water breather or derives its oxygen from the water, it's water breathing, it may very well hardly ever need to surface. And so, the idea that a colony of creatures, maybe anywhere from sort of 10 to 25 feet in length, could actually hide out there and not be found actually isn't implausible. And of course, if they are predominantly water-living creatures, then when they die, they're just going to sink to the bottom of the loch. And bear in mind, as I said, 1,000-foot deep loch with pitch black water. It's going to be very, very difficult to actually find one of these creatures unless we actually catch it in the act, sort of basking on the shore or something, which, granted, there have been a few reports along those lines decades ago, but certainly nothing in recent years. So, I think that explains possibly why we haven't caught the thing. Now, as far as what it is, that's a different matter entirely. There's no doubt that up until the last ice age, Loch Ness was open to the oceans, and then it became landlocked when the ice came down and basically, covered the exit points. And some people have suggested that may well have meant that creatures that possibly, were indigenous to the oceans, if you like, made their way in there and adapted to living in a freshwater environment. One of the theories that's often put forward is a plesiosaur, a still living dinosaur. Other people have suggested, by definition, monstrous size eels. Other people have suggested that maybe it's a creature that science hasn't even classified yet, that, it doesn't belong to a known type of animal, whether extinct or not. The best that I can say is that I'm convinced that something lives in Loch Ness, a colony of some sort of creature that predominantly is water-based, but occasionally appears to come out on the land, particularly at night, although there haven't, as I said, been many of these reports, if any, for decades, but certainly there was a proliferation in the 30s and 40s of people seeing this large neck creature sort of basking on the shore late at night, or even crossing the road in one of two cases and lit up by the headlamps of motorbikes and cars. I think, that's about as much as I can say in terms of what it may be. I think it's there. I'm just not entirely sure what it is.
Right. Well, and I guess we won't be sure until somebody catches one or gets a very clear photograph. So from Loch Ness,
right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that unfortunately, although I'd like to get the answers to what a lot of these mystery animals are, I think in many cases the most unfortunate thing is that it's going to take a body to actually prove it. And, I'd hate for us to get the proof by having to kill one of these things. I would much prefer it if we could secure undeniable film footage or something like that. Or possibly, if it was a creature that wasn't that difficult to catch, catch it, tag it, and then let it go. But I have a nagging suspicion that if we ever prove these things really exist, it's going to come by, somebody actually killing one and it being autopsied. But, that's just one of the unfortunate hazards. Mm-hmm.
Maybe not even then, because I recall a few years ago, and I think Whitley was involved in this, they found what they thought was the body of one of the chupacabras here in Texas, and yet there they had physical evidence in their hands, and yet there was an argument over what it was, and most people never even heard of that story. Well, Nick, moving on from Loch Ness, let's get back to your 5-year journey into mystery and intrigue and these fabulous monsters. What was the one case that you've investigated that struck you as being very well-founded in fact and documentation?
Okay. Well, just to give people background, the book basically begins, it's kind of like written in a first-person road trip format, and it begins with me moving to the US in the summer of 2001, and then goes on to the summer of 2006 when we moved back to England for a year. And basically, it covers a whole range of weird creatures, or cryptids as they're commonly known. Everything from lake monsters, Bigfoot, werewolf encounters even, the chupacabras, and a variety of other lesser well-known creatures around the United States. And basically, I traveled around road trip style, investigating these things and interviewing the witnesses. I would have to say that probably the most impressive collective body of testimony that I found came during the course of my two expeditions to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabras that you referred to earlier. Now, I'm sure everybody listening to the show has heard of the chupacabras of Puerto Rico, this strange, I guess almost vampire-like creature that reportedly or reputedly lives on the blood of the local animal population. And, we've read about the reports, seen the articles in the magazines and the newspapers, etc. But for me, at least, I only began to appreciate the sheer scale and seriousness of the subject when I actually got out there. I've done 2 expeditions to Puerto Rico, each for several weeks at a time. And the most recent one a week at a time. And what I found was that there's a great deal of interest, belief, and superstition surrounding the chupacabras. It's taken very, very seriously, not just by the islanders, but also by the local civil defense people who actively investigate these reports if ranchers and farmers report the incidents to them. They almost have like a rapid response team, I guess is the best way to describe it, who go out there and collect the animals, autopsy them, and try and determine what happened. And I think it was the chupacabras more than anything else, which was the one case that was, for me, was almost like, wow, there's no doubt this thing exists. I spoke with a number of highly credible witnesses who told me very interesting and impressive stories about encountering the chupacabras, quite literally up close and personal. And basically, we can talk about some of those stories, some of those cases, and, get into what the witnesses told me.
Okay. Well, let's do that right after we take this break. And this is your host, Jim Mars. We're on Dreamland, and we're speaking with Nick Redfern, and we'll be right back after this.
Later on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe has a report about that bizarre smoke cloud that was seen in Canada last week. What were the objects that were observed before the smoke cloud appeared? Was this an Atlas rocket, as NASA suspects, or was it something very, very different? We'll find out in the Linda Moulton Howe segment at the end of the show. Subscribers, did you know that you can get The Path and the Key together for $11 off or $5 off each book? Just use the coupon in the subscriber section to get your copy of The Path and the Key.
Howdy, it's Jim Mars, and we're back here on Dreamland with Nick Redfern. We're talking about cryptids, or to the uninitiated, monsters. And we've been talking, he said that the most documented cases that he has found has to do with the chupacabra, the goat sucker. And he's made several trips to Puerto Rico. But, Nick, I know there's also been reports in Mexico and Texas, so that leads me to believe that we're not just talking about one monster, are we?
No, I think it's fair to say that a lot of areas around the world have encounters or reports of strange creatures that, in some respects, all seem to be connected with, I guess, blood-sucking activities in simplistic terms, vampire-like creatures. Certainly, the chupacabras in today's society is the most famous. Chupacabras is Latin for goat sucker, and it takes its name from the fact that certainly in the early years of chupacabras attacks, it was goats predominantly that were found dead with blood removed and even with the classic 2 puncture marks found on the neck. Now, when I went out to Puerto Rico for the first time in 2004, I interviewed a number of ranchers, farmers who related their accounts to me and even showed me photographs of some of their animals and their livestock that had been killed, and which did indeed show 2 puncture marks on the neck and statements from veterinarians that, yes, there was a large amount of blood missing from the bodies of the animals. What was interesting is that, unlike, your classic wild animal, there was never any attempt on the part of these animals to eat the creatures, the livestock, I mean, and the bodies weren't torn apart. It was almost as if they'd been sort of disabled or anesthetized, knocked out, and then the blood was drained from. There was very, very little damage to the bodies. No evidence that, the animals had tried to run away or escape before they were attacked. Pretty much all the farmers and ranchers I spoke to, none of them reported that, there was this huge uproar in the cages or the pens, with the animals screaming and crying. It literally was a case as if, something had come in and knocked them out and then then drained the blood from them. And in some respects, that sort of, I guess, created parallels with some of the cattle mutilations incidents in the US, where something seems to come in very, very stealthily, doesn't kick up a lot of fuss, and kills the animals, takes the blood, and then it's gone as mysteriously as it appeared. Most of the people I interviewed who described the chupacabras described it as being sort of 4 to 5 feet tall. Several of them said it had large, leathery, bat-like wings, or in one case somebody described it as having pterodactyl-style wings. So I guess that gives an indication, of its body, how it looked, with a somewhat of a monkey-like face and, on several occasions, glowing eyes, which seemed to be self-illuminating rather than reflecting the headlights off car vehicles, shall we say. The earliest accounts I actually found came from the 1970s, which surprised me because most of the reports that have surfaced on the internet or in the magazines predominantly date from the 90s onwards. But in speaking with the locals and even a number of police officers, I learned that there were legends going back to the 70s of something that became known as the Mocha vampire. The Mocha is an area of Puerto Rico, and again, this related to unexplained animal deaths where creatures have been found drained of blood. So my opinion on the fact that, hey, this seems to be a new phenomenon changed. And I think what's actually happened is that with the proliferation of, the internet, TV, etc., I think it's just been reported more today, where if you actually look back into the subject, we find reports going back years and decades even. So I think whatever this creature is, it's been lurking on the island, for a very, very long time.
Wow. Well, I know, to my knowledge, it seems to be that with the proliferation of chupacabra sightings, they seem to coincide with sightings of UFOs, and I know that's another subject that you're fascinated in. Do you see a connection between UFOs and the chupacabra?
I do, in the sense that there's certainly been a lot of chupacabra reports, sightings, and attacks in the direct vicinity where UFOs have been seen. Now, what the relationship is with the UFOs, I'm not sure. Some people have said, is it like a genetic experiment? Some people have said, in simplistic terms, is it something that they've simply released onto the island as like a bizarre biological experiment? Is it something that's escaped, from a UFO or a lab? There are lots of theories and questions. One of the things I can say for certain is that one of the most intriguing cases I investigated where there was an attack on farmland and a number of animals had been killed, excuse me, the same farmer told me that several nights previously he'd seen this huge black triangular-shaped UFO come slowly rising out of the ocean, which interestingly enough, he described how he could see it. It was still dusk. It wasn't complete pitch darkness. And he said as it rose out of the ocean, it was as if the water on the side of the craft or the vehicle was almost stuck to it and dripped off it very, very slowly, like a thick liquid would, I guess, if you poured it down the side of a metal sheet. And he didn't have no
gel, perhaps.
Yeah, but it was just seawater, but it reacted almost like a gel as it was going down the side of the craft. And he said this thing shot off at high speed when it came out of the ocean. And then lo and behold, as I said, a couple of nights later, he had these strange animal deaths. And I can think of at least 5 or 6 people I interviewed during the collective trips I made to Puerto Rico who also reported chupacabra attacks in the same time frame and vicinities that UFOs were seen. And also, interestingly enough, a number of people who said they'd seen very, very small balls of light zipping around their property in the build-up to chupacabra attacks. And when I say small balls of light, I mean literally anything from a golf ball to a tennis ball. But they appeared to be under intelligent control. And one of the people I interviewed actually wondered if they were some form of life form themselves. They were actually exhibiting intelligence, but they seemed to be, as I said, zipping around properties, hovering over rooftops at very low levels, and then again, 2 nights or 2 days later, the farm would wake up and find his animals dead. So, there's definitely a connection there. Are they?
But we don't know whether or not they have a direct connection with the chupacabras, as you said, either seeding them onto the island or other places, or
I think
whether perhaps they're just as fascinated with them as we are, and they're simply tracking them and trying to figure out what's going on with them too.
I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, one of the things I found is that Puerto Rico is an unusual place. There's a lot of weirdness there. Everything, as I said, from the chupacabras to UFOs. We found evidence of a lot of occult and devil worship cults and organizations on the island as well. Voodoo, black magic, yeah, exactly, things like that. Even reports of a creature that was very, very eerily similar to the famous Velociraptor out of Jurassic Park, this small, fast-moving, highly intelligent dinosaur-type creature. People talking about seeing black panthers, pumas, which certainly aren't indigenous to the island, but roaming free in the El Yunque rainforest. So it's almost like an enclosed, classic X-Files type location, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Right. How fascinating. Well, here's what gets me is even at its most mundane, we might be talking about a whole new species of animals. Why do you suppose it is that the mainstream media and scientific community hasn't taken a greater interest in this subject?
Well, I think there's actually several reasons, and I think, unfortunately, one of the reasons why the so-called mainstream and so-called serious scientific community, I like to put the so-called in first, don't take it seriously is they're just fearful of upsetting their reputations very often. I think, certain people they just don't have the guts to say, hang on, if my colleagues disagree with me and poke fun, that doesn't matter. I'm passionate about this and I believe there's something to it, so I'm going to look into it. I think a lot of them just don't have the guts to do that. They're fearful about losing educational grants or fearful of what their peers and colleagues are going to say, so they back away. And I think also the second chief reason is that, given the nature of the world today and our egos in believing that we know everything that's out there, there's this tendency to think that there's no way, that something like a Bigfoot or the abominable snowman or the Loch Ness Monster could possibly exist, and for the scientific community not to have found it or the zoological community not to have found it and know about it. I think, the idea that they exist, certain people in these communities think, oh, there's no way a 7-foot ape or something like that could be roaming the woods. We would have found it. What a lot of people forget is that the giant panda wasn't actually fully confirmed to exist until the early part of this century, and even up until the mid part of the 19th century, the mountain gorilla was still a creature that sort of straddled the realms of reality and mythology. So it actually hasn't been that long since we discovered these large life forms, and so the idea that there could be other ones out there, I think, is very possible. It's just that the scientific community tends to take the approach that they know it all and dismiss it. I think that's the problem and the hurdle we face.
Right, but they just don't want to tarnish their image of having supreme scientific knowledge. Nick, thank you. Hang on. We're going to be right back, folks, after these messages. Don't leave. There's more interesting monster information coming up.
Next week, folks, John Hogue is going to be with us with his 2008 predictions. As you know, John is Dreamland's resident prophet, and every year in January he makes his predictions. Then, to keep him honest, we hold his feet to the fire in July, as we did last year. Usually the results are surprising because this guy is a good prophet, and he can prove it. Don't miss next week's Dreamland Plus subscribers. You'll soon have a chance to chat live with John Hogue and with Nick Redfern. Both of them are lined up for the chat room. Watch the subscriber newsletter and the free newsletter for dates and times.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland Online with guest host Jim Mars.
Howdy, this is Jim Mars. Welcome back to Dreamland. Today we're talking with Nick Redfern, the author of Memoirs of a Monster Hunter. And we've been talking about the chupacabras. We've mentioned the abominable snowman. And Nick, of course, made the very valid point that there are several species, including the panda bear, which were thought to be mythological until even within the 20th century. So it's certainly not impossible that there's something else out there. Nick, have you been able to track any particular monster case and then basically debunk it and prove that there really wasn't anything that unusual there?
I wouldn't necessarily say debunk it as such. What I would say is I think in some cases we've been able to demystify what some of these things are. And by that I mean, when we talk about monsters, of course, that evokes a lot of descriptive imagery and so forth. I think what a lot of these things are, in actual fact, are just some type of weird animal that science hasn't classified, or that maybe science believes has become extinct but that survived extinction, or creatures, that we just don't know about yet. So I think that, when we talk about like the Loch Ness Monster, by definition, that's what it is. But in reality, it's probably just, an unusual animal. And I think that's the point I've tried to get across to people is that, okay, the book's called Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, but in saying that, we're trying to seek out, different types of animal that we believe exist. So that's what I try and do, is demystify the subject to where, it has a grounding, it has a base, and, a firm grasp on reality. We're not just chasing Godzilla or something like that.
Right. Fantastic. Now, let me ask you this, because in the course of this conversation, you mentioned vampires and werewolves. Do you draw a line at any point between what you consider monsters with some basis in fact, photographs, documentation, multiple witnesses, and then what we commonly see in the horror movies is werewolves, vampires? Do you put any credence in the stories of vampires, werewolves?
Well, it's interesting, Jim, that when you look at cryptozoology, as I said, we have unknown animals that maybe science hasn't discovered. We have creatures that possibly we believe have become extinct, but that maybe have survived in certain isolated pockets of the world. But then there are other reports that almost seem to have paranormal qualities to them. And certain cryptozoologists get quite hostile to this aspect of the subject. They don't like dealing with it. For example, Bigfoot. They just perceive it as a straightforward flesh and blood animal. However, there are a number of intriguing reports of Bigfoot, vanishing in flash of a light, if you like, things like this, which are much harder to describe and to try and rationalize. Now, when you talk about werewolves, I've always had a particular fascination with werewolf-type stories and encounters, literally going back to as a child, and, would devour books on the subject all the time. And I've investigated quite extensively, and for the book as well, werewolf reports around the US. Now, if people ask me, I don't personally believe at all that people are sprouting hair, fangs, and claws at the sight of a full moon and, baying at the moon and howling at the darkness, if you like. I don't think that's going on. I think there's two possibilities. Some reports where people have described werewolves, they've described what sounds like a very, very large species of wolf or type of wolf, far bigger than the average wolf that exists today. Now, if you look back in the fossil record, there certainly were very, very large wolves that existed in times past, in prehistoric times, that would just killer wolves, if you like, that would, take down something the size of a buffalo even. And there have been rumours, stories, theories suggested by cryptozoologists that, again, maybe in certain dense, isolated forests in the US, that certain pockets of these ancient wolves could have survived, and that maybe they're responsible for some of these reports. Now, when we come to the classic imagery of the werewolf, i.e. a man-like figure walking around on two legs, hairy, and, with a wolf-like face, that I think we're dealing with something distinctly different. Most of the reports, if not all of them, that I've looked into that fall into that category, all seem to have paranormal overtones to them, with a lot of reports emanating from, in England, ancient stone circles, in the United States, Native American burial grounds and places like that, areas of prehistoric and archaeological significance, often near bodies of water, areas that, as I said, Native American Indians considered to be of historical significance as well. Now, what that means, we're not entirely sure, but, if these were living flesh and blood animals, I think we would see them at random, but we always seem to see them in these specific areas of key significance. And, I think this comes into play somewhere. A number of people have suggested that maybe ancient man had the ability to conjure up imagery from their mind, which they could project outwardly, and they actually kind of created like a thought form, which would act as like almost like a burglar alarm, to scare people off. That it wasn't a physical creature; it was actually a manifestation of the mind designed to scare people, and that these things, perhaps in some sort of quasi existence, still roam today. Not really flesh and blood animals, not really just a product of the mind, but something in between. So I don't doubt that people see werewolves or what are perceived to be werewolves, but I think they're a paranormal entity, if you like, rather than classic flesh and blood. And that's one of the areas that particularly interests me, is the area of so-called tulpas, mind monsters, if you like, thought forms that the human mind can project outwardly and that require us to believe in them to an extent, to allow them to exist. I think that's a possibility that comes into play with some of these monster reports as well. The more we would believe in them, the more sustenance they derive from us and the more substance then they have in the real world.
Well, that's
not a particularly popular theory with a lot of cryptozoologists, but, I say what I think, and if it goes down well, fine. If it doesn't, that's fine with me too. So.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. What in your 5-year journey, where did that take you? Did you? I'm sure you traveled to very different states and different towns, and did you find any commonality, or did they all have their own unique cases of the unknown?
Well, it's interesting that most nations around the world, not even just states in the US, seem to have a number of common themes to them and legends and mythology when it comes to weird creatures. You get the classic hairy ape man type character. You get lake monsters. You often get out-of-place big cats, panthers, pumas. In England and even in the US, we get a lot of what have become known as ghostly black devil dogs, these sort of hellhounds that people report as like a Grim Reaper type character. And we also get unknown winged creatures, like in the US, the Mothman and the man-bat of Wisconsin, and in England, the owlman, and various other creatures that have been reported throughout history that seem to fall into this category. A lot of reports as well, and I know you looked into one of these years ago, particularly in the US, you get a lot of the reports of the so-called cloven-hoofed goat men. So it seems to be these classic categories, and, as far as your question was concerned, where it's taken me from pretty much, every state. I think the ironic thing is, one of the areas that I found a lot of reports of weird animals is right here in Texas. That's the ironic thing, that in some of the best cases I looked into, I actually didn't have to travel that far. One of the most...
Well, that's interesting you say that, because you just answered my next question. Which state seems to host the most stories about these creatures? And I would take it Texas is definitely one of them.
Texas is definitely one of them.
There have been reports, sporadic reports in South Texas of a giant winged creature. Have you looked into that one?
Yeah, the various reports have surfaced literally going back decades, and in some cases a lot longer than that, of giant winged creatures in southern Texas and very often bordering on Mexico as well. Some people have described them as being like the classic thunderbird from Native American Indian legends, like this literally a huge bird. Other people, however, have suggested a creature that seems to have more pterodactyl-style characteristics, the large bat wings, like an elongated, snapping jaw. Now, again, what these things are, we're not sure. They certainly appear to be much larger than natural birds. There's no doubt about that at all. I've investigated a number of these cases and liaised with a friend of mine named Ken Gerard, who lives in San Antonio, who recently wrote a book called Big Bird, which chronicled all his investigations. And I met up with Ken just recently for dinner. And he was explaining to me and telling me about some of the cases he's investigated. And there's no doubt in my mind that some sort of giant bird-like creature is in evidence in the southern parts of Texas, and possibly even up as far as San Antonio in some of the woods around there and Austin. Is it a surviving relic of something, or is it a creature we haven't identified? I'm just not sure. But again, this is prime evidence of how numerous places around the world have these tales of these giant birds, shall we say.
Well, that's correct, and it's also quite fascinating. Why do you suppose it is? Well, let's assume that there is a surviving pterodactyl or something of that type that still might be flying around in southern Texas and northern Mexico. Why do you suppose it is that nobody has gotten a good photograph or found a carcass?
Well, I think possibly one of the unfortunate things is, and we can apply this to these giant birds and other types of mystery animal as well, I think the more we kind of infringe upon their environments and build up the cities and create pollution and everything else, I think some of these creatures, unfortunately, may well be coming extinct before we actually prove they exist in the first place. Certainly in Loch Ness, for example, there's been a dramatic drop in reports in recent years, and I suspect that that's certainly the case with some of the creatures over here as well. And, that may well explain why we haven't got the good evidence or the strong evidence. I think certainly in some cases that we may well underestimate the intelligence of some of these creatures. There's good evidence I found on Puerto Rico that the chupacabras isn't just some sort of wild rampaging creature, that in certain reports of how it had attacked the animals, and even as one farmer related to me, opened the complex locks on the cages, suggests it may well, exhibit a high degree of intelligence. So if that is the case, it could well be that some of these creatures are well versed in the fact that, humankind isn't exactly the most civilized creature on the planet, and we'd be a good species to keep away from. I think that's a possibility, where people are, they try and stay away from or come out at night and do whatever it is they're doing. I think that is a possibility also. The fact that most people, I guess, aren't out in the woods and the fields late at night, because it's pitch black and we don't see a great deal. I think, that also comes into play.
Yeah, that may exhibit some, as you say, higher form of intelligence, that they're intelligent enough to know to stay away from gun-toting humans.
Yeah, and particularly in Texas.
Especially in Texas. Well, let me ask you, Nick, in all your travels looking into this admittedly strange and unknown animals, cryptids, what has been the response of the people when you go up and try to talk to them? Are they pretty open and honest about all this, or do they run you off their land, or what are their reactions?
I've been fortunate in the sense that most people that have seen things and want to report them and talk about them are quite happy to do so. The last thing they want, and this is completely understandable, and I would never do this, is to have people ridicule them. If you have someone who sees something and then in good faith tells you about it, and they come across as credible, genuine, honest, down to earth, I feel we have a duty to relate that and to tell people, how credible the people are. I think there is this reluctance or concern, which I totally understand, that someone's going to be portrayed in a bad light or in a ridiculous light because they claim to have seen Bigfoot or, the Loch Ness Monster. I think when people realize that you are going to treat them seriously and fairly, then they open up more. And I think also a lot of people don't realize, how many other people see these things. They think, I've just seen that mythical creature. There's no way I can mention this. And it's only when they realize and begin to read books on the subject, well, hang on, a lot of people have seen these things and I'm actually in good company. Then they open up more. So I think when you can gain people's confidence and trust, that's the first thing to do. And then you find they open up more. I'd never try and go in brash and say, I demand to know everything you tell me. I always say, whatever you feel comfortable in telling me, tell me, and, we'll discuss it openly, fairly, and, I'll treat you in a way that, offers respect in a way that it should be done. So.
Well, I appreciate that and honor you for that, because I think that strikes right to the heart of true, objective and fair-minded journalism. And you know what? I was just thinking this may explain why the so-called mainstream media does not investigate these cases more thoroughly is that it would put them in a position of either presenting material in a straightforward manner, which would seem to put their imprimatur on the story, or they would, as they all too often do, ridicule the people that they bring on, which I think they realize would create a backlash in the minds of more fair-minded people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with you, Jim.
Right. Okay, well, we're talking to Nick Redfern, and we'll continue hunting monsters right after this. Howdy, this is Jim Mars, your guest today here on Dreamland, and we're back with Nick Redfern talking about cryptids, chupacabras, ape men, and even werewolves. Nick, what about vampires? Do you think that perhaps the stories out of Europe about people who suck blood, do you think that that's strictly stories and legends, or do you think that there may be a basis somewhere in there for some factual information?
Well, it's like werewolves, I guess, Jim. I don't believe in the classic, or the existence of like the classic werewolf, the classic vampire, dressed in black with like a waiter's outfit on and, cloak and turning into a bat at the full moon and so forth. I don't think that's going on. However, if you look back into a lot of early vampire type stories, particularly from Europe, what you find is this core body of evidence of animals and even people having been found drained of blood, the blood sucked from them under mysterious circumstances. And, my own belief based on my investigations is that a lot of the classic vampire legends have grown up purely because superstitious villagers and townsfolk back then didn't really know how to explain these cases. They would find their animals and even townsfolk dead. What killed them? And then these legends and tales start to surface. But that doesn't take away the fact that there appears to be something at the core of these mysteries. And I mean, I'll give you a couple of classic cases. There have been various reports from Britain the last 3 or 4 decades which I've investigated and which actually got hold of a number of British police files on the subject of animals being found drained of blood in England. In some cases, seem to exhibit vampire-like attacks. In other cases, were drained of blood, but there was also evidence of occult and satanic rituals, etc., having been taken place in the vicinity of where these attacks occurred. Now, again, the question is, were these attacks done by people, or is it possible that some of these occult rites actually manifested, some sort of paranormal creature and that they did the killings? I mean, that theory is being put forward. I'm just, again, not sure, but there's no doubt that I think, in my mind at least, that vampire legends and tales have a basis in something that was, carrying out these attacks in the same way that the chupacabras carries out attacks on Puerto Rico and drains blood, and I think that, is a real creature as well. So.
Right. Well, let's turn our attention to one of the biggest mysteries and controversies that's been going on in this country for a long time, and that has to do with Bigfoot. I think most people have the idea that Bigfoot is only centered up in the Pacific Northwest. I recall hearing stories of Bigfoot or a similar type creature here in Texas, particularly in the piney woods of East Texas. Have you heard those stories, and have you looked into that aspect?
Yeah, I have 2 whole chapters in Memoirs of a Monster Hunter on Bigfoot-type creatures in the Big Thicket area of Texas. The Big Thicket's actually not too far from Houston and not too far from where we used to live when we were down by Beaumont. Big Thicket is a very, very large, thick area of forest land, and it's been the site of numerous Bigfoot activity going back again decades and also back to Native American Indian years. And many of the reports fit the classic description of hairy man-beasts, wild men of the woods, if you like, that today we know as Bigfoot. Again, a friend of mine, Rob Riggs, wrote a book about this called In the Big Thicket. I've been out to the area with Rob on several occasions during daylight and during the night time as well, literally through the night. And it's a strange and eerie place, and you can quite easily imagine how, you know, creatures like this could live deep in the woods there, which are very, very intense, deep woods that, you know, unless you're an experienced woodsman, you know, you're just not going to be able to hack your way through and find your way out even. It's very, very thick and dense. But again, the interesting thing for me that I found is that where you have the big thicket wildman, we also get a lot of reports of strange balls of light, which are very, very similar to the so-called and more famous Marfa lights of Texas. I actually saw one of these on one occasion. There's a photograph of one of them in the book, which I literally quite literally snapped at the last second as it literally floated over the road about 30 feet above the team of us. And so, again, this suggests to me that even if Bigfoot is a flesh and blood entity, that there seems to be a paranormal quality to it as well. Now, in addition to the Bigfoot or the wild man of the big thicket, Caddo Lake also has Bigfoot history and Bigfoot lore attached to it. A number of reports have surfaced from there over the years. Going back decades even, there was even the so-called wild man of the Navidad. And feral children, wolf children reported on the Del Rio River, all of which I talk about in the book and have discussed. So, you know, that's one of the interesting things and quite satisfying for me to live in Texas and know that, you know, I can pretty much go up and down the state and investigate a lot of these things firsthand.
Deep in the heart of of mystery territory.
Yeah.
Well, before we go any further, tell everyone where they can get hold of your book, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter.
Okay. Well, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter is published by New Page Books, and it's available at all good online book-selling companies and all major stores, Barnes and Noble, etc. So, you know, click online or take a ride to the shops, and you'll be able to get it there quite easily, hopefully.
Well, I would hope so, because this is most fascinating to a lot of people, and of course, any good mystery should be of interest to just about anyone. In your studies and in your tracking of Bigfoot, what have you found that is available in the way of physical evidence, cast of footprints or photographs or whatever?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that in most of the cases I've looked into, it's either been footprints. You know, somebody's recorded huge footprints, plaster casts have been made, etc., which seem to offer, to me at least, convincing evidence of the reality of these creatures. One of the things that I've found on a number of occasions, and this actually doesn't surface too often, but if you look into the Bigfoot literature, you'll find that there's like an undercurrent of this particular aspect of the subject, and that's what have become known as Bigfoot teepees, which may sound like a strange description, but in a lot of areas where you have weird creature and Bigfoot type activity, you can go deep in the woods and find evidence of where or what are perceived to be creatures have, if you like, snapped very, very thick branches, twigs off trees and placed them in kind of like pyramid teepee style formations. Now, a lot of these exhibit evidence of very thick branches, you know, where you would need a lot of strength to snap these things, never mind stand them up and put them into these complex teepee pyramid formations. Various theories have been put forward, everything from the idea that maybe these are like territorial markers that the creatures build to either warn away others of their species or even perhaps to, you know, encourage them to come forward. One of the ironic things is that me and Ken Gerard, who I referred to earlier, we investigated a case that you looked into years ago, the Goat Man of Lake Worth, Texas, which many people think is a hoax. And we went out to Greer Island, where some of the reports occurred, and actually found deep on Greer Island one of these classic teepee structures. And
wow.
Again,
Nick, I hate to interrupt you at this point, but we've run out of time here on Dreamland on this edition, and but as we both know, and as the audience can clearly hear, there is just so much that could be said. So I would encourage everyone to run out and get a copy of your book, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter. And Nick, it's been a delight, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Jim. I appreciate it and enjoyed it. Thank you.
And this is Jim Mars, your host today on Dreamland, signing off.
You know, folks, each week Linda Moulton Howe brings us something new to wonder at, to be concerned about, to be amazed by, and this week is no exception. A couple of weeks ago, two people in Canada observed and videotaped a very strange smoke trail and some other things as well. It's not been very carefully reported, but Linda's gotten into it quite deeply, and I think you're going to be absolutely fascinated with the results as presented by our Emmy Award-winning Dreamland science reporter, none other than Linda Moulton Howe of EarthFiles.com, and don't miss a single day. It is really one of the pleasures of my day to go to EarthFiles.com. It is absolutely amazing, and as soon as you hit it, just scroll down that great big front page, and you will be open to things that you have just never believed possible before. It's an extraordinary resource, and you can subscribe to it as well and keep her going. Here she is from EarthFiles.com and Albuquerque, New Mexico, Linda Moulton Howe.
Well, thank you, Whitley. And before I get into this very strange dark spiral in the Canadian skies, I want to first begin with some news that when I first saw this press release on the Internet this week, the first week of January, I have to confess I was very puzzled and wondered, was this science or was it politics? Now, to set the stage, 1 month ago on December 11th, 2007, a patch of magnetism on the sun was declared by NASA to be the first official sunspot of the new solar cycle 24. The spot was in a high latitude on the sun with reverse polarity from the previous solar cycle 23 that has been a minimum for a long time now. The sun has had a blank face without any sunspots for days and weeks at a time. But from now forward to 2012, sunspots should start appearing again all over the sun, leading to what NASA astrophysicist David Hathaway thinks will be one of the most intense solar maximums on record. Dr. Hathaway is the solar physics team leader at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He received his PhD in astrophysics from the University of Colorado in Boulder in 1979. Dr. Hathaway is now one of the top solar physicists in the world, and he was surprised last week in the beginning of January 2008 to learn that his own solar physics research was being used by a non-scientist named John Casey in an Orlando, Florida company calling itself, quote, Space and Science Research Center, unquote. SSRC recently distributed an alarming press release on the Internet entitled, quote, Changes in the Sun's Surface to Bring Next Climate Change, unquote, which warns there will be a global food shortage in the next solar cycle 25. Well, this week I talked with Dr. Hathaway about this press release and his own perceptions about what's expected in this current solar cycle 24 and beyond.
In the beginning of a cycle, it's a little like popping popcorn, where first one spot will come out, and then you wait, and then there's another, and then bam, 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 and off it goes, and the cycle is on its way. We're expecting the cycle will start rising here in the next few months and should reach its maximum in about 2011, 2012 sort of time frame. And, of course, maximum is where the sun is particularly active, and compared to where we are now, where we've gone for days and weeks at a time without any sunspots at all. During maximum, we should see lots of spots on the sun. Even the low predictions for this cycle indicate that at maximum there ought to be, on a given day, something like 70 or 80 spots on the sun.
Now, the last time that we talked, there was dispute about whether this was going to be a really intense and active X-flare solar maximum in 2011, 12, 13 time period, or whether it was going to be very mild. Is the science on this now any clearer?
Unfortunately, no. We continue to do research. It really comes down to two models and two different techniques for predicting the size of the next cycle, both of which agreed on the last cycle but disagree on this one, and we really haven't got to the bottom of it yet.
Do you still expect it to be a highly intense cycle 24 maximum?
I'm still sticking with it. That's right. There are a number of indicators that suggested that it should be a big cycle, and there's a very good model out there that has been shown to be extremely accurate in going back in time and trying to predict the last 8 cycles, and shows that they can do it with a skill that's better than any of the other techniques out there, and that model is also suggesting that it ought to be a much bigger than average cycle.
We will be then entering another solar minimum at around 2017, right?
2017 or 18, about then. Yeah, about 11 years from now, we ought to be back in another minimum phase of the sunspot cycle.
And that will be called Solar Cycle 25. And there has been a press release that's been circulating on the web from an organization called Space and Science Research Center in Orlando, Florida. The director is John Casey. And they have released information saying that they expect Solar Cycle 25 to be so low in sunspots that it will plunge the Earth into a cooling period that could jeopardize food crops globally. Could you comment on his hypothesis?
I find it highly doubtful. First of all, he bases the prediction for a small cycle 25 on my own work, and I'm well familiar with my own work. And this was where we had looked at the drift rate of sunspots on the sun, and from that inferred flows that contribute to how the sun makes sunspot cycles. And that flow was particularly slow during this last cycle, cycle 23. In fact, slower than any of the previous 12 cycles. We've also found a correlation with the strength of that flow and the strength of the cycle 2 cycles away. And it fits in with this same model that is predicting that the next cycle ought to be a large cycle. Given that, we went out on a limb and suggested that cycle 25 ought to be a much smaller than average cycle because that flow during cycle 23 was much smaller than average. But there's a lot of scatter in the measurements. It's not a perfect relationship, and our uncertainty just from that one relationship and how big cycle 25 is going to be is give or take 30% or something. He claims that he's got evidence that corroborates our own research in suggesting that cycle 25 ought to be a small cycle. But then there's other steps involved in getting from that to global cooling. Part of that is, to what extent does solar variability, the sunspot cycle, contribute to global warming, for instance? And our best estimates, if I look at the sunspot record and I look at the temperature record, it suggests that the sun influences temperature at about the 20 or 30% level. When we look at the correlation between sunspots, the sunspot cycle, and temperature, it's not a really tight fit, and there are other things that are far more important, things like El Nino, things like volcanic eruptions, and of course things like greenhouse gases that also influence that, and each of those probably influence it a greater extent than solar activity. So making the conclusion that a small cycle 25 means that we're going to go into global cooling, I think is really pushing it. It's taking the extremes of 2 or 3 different measurements and adding them together to say that it's going to be the effect. I'm highly suspicious of the result.
Well, it seems like there is an irony here also that if solar cycle 25 did bring any cooling, it might be offset by the global warming CO2 greenhouse gas blanket that is building up around the Earth?
Now, that certainly is a possibility as far as if the sun does come in at 20 to 30% and it's particularly low then it would be slightly offsetting, yes.
And that we might be worrying about something that could protect us during that period.
I think the word you use, temper, the amount of warming we have, it may do that. But again, it's also predicated on cycle 25 actually being a small cycle. And as far as I know, the only real indication of that is, in fact, the study I did on this flow on the sun and how it's related to future activity.
Now, while the sun is still a mystery to Earth astrophysicists, the skies of our planet continue to have phenomena that baffle most everyone. For instance, Canadian UFO researchers say that their number of unexplained aerial lights and craft reports for 2007 exceeds 650. And of those, one of the strangest occurred on Boxer Day, December 26, 2007. The time was 5:30 p.m. at dusk. Marie Ford Quigley and her husband were driving near the small town of North Tryon on the south side of Prince Edward Island off the east coast of Canada. What happened next made this headline on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's TV broadcasts and Internet news. Quote, "Dark spiral in sky remains a mystery," unquote. Well, I talked about the mysterious aerial dark spiral this week with Chris Rutowski, Research Coordinator for Ufology Research, also known as Uforum in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
A couple had been driving home from an event, and they happened to be looking up in the sky and saw an odd object. Now, this was about 5:30 in the evening, right at dusk, and they saw a very odd circular object. It looked to be white or gray in color. It seemed to have a small little tail coming out of it, which was, to them, very odd. It didn't look like an aircraft. Didn't appear to be a helicopter. It didn't appear to be anything that they were familiar with. And it seemed to be moving in a very odd corkscrew-like pattern through the sky. It was heading away from them, heading westward towards the mainland of Canada across the bay. They watched for a while. They arrived home and immediately went and got their video camera, and they began taking some video of this as well. The entire time that they were watching this, they were just amazed because it did not look like anything familiar. They managed to get about 8 or 9 minutes on video before it passed into the west very low. In fact, the strangest thing about this is that about halfway through it traveling across the sky, it started giving off thick black smoke. And because it was moving in a very odd corkscrew pattern, the smoke began to form in a corkscrew pattern as well, trailing behind it. And they watched this corkscrew-like smoke trail form as this thing continued to progress across the sky for the remainder of the sighting. So it was in sight for about a total of 1/2 hour, and because it was in sight for so long, it automatically ruled out a number of things. It certainly wasn't a meteor. There have been some checks made with Transport Canada, the Aviation Board, plus Environment Canada, which would have been the weather office. And they have also viewed the video, and they don't know what this was. We don't believe, even though it seemed like something was crashing, it proceeded very, very far downrange, so it's difficult to say where this thing might have actually come down. But we're fairly certain it wasn't an aircraft. It was not a helicopter. The corkscrew-like pattern is very curious. You can actually see it in some detail within the video. It's very, very puzzling. We have no idea at this time what the identity of this object ultimately is.
Could you clarify something for me from listening to Marie Ford Quigley, the wife, as she was trying to hold the camera steady? You hear her say, this is taking a very long time to get to the ground. And I had the impression that she was watching something that was spiraling down toward the ground as opposed to away to the horizon.
This object was moving away from them, but it was also descending. And so from a perspective point of view, it definitely looked like it was going down towards the ground. And eventually, at the very end of the video, you can see the smoke trail just about touch the horizon. Now, whether that meant that it actually fell into the ocean or was just simply simply passing out of sight beyond the Earth's curve because it was so far away. It's difficult to say, but it was going down and away from them. In addition, we have since found a few more witnesses who said that they had seen the black trail in the sky. We're trying to track down additional people as well who might have seen it before it started making the black smoke trail. But at this point, we've only found people who had seen the trail.
Okay. Now, just so I'm really clear, when Mr. and Mrs. Ford Quigley first saw that white object, was it alone in the sky without any trace of black around it?
Absolutely. It was in the sky without any trace. When it was first brought to their attention, it was starting to descend through some cloud layers. In fact, in a portion of the video that is not on the website, they had actually sent me some of the raw footage from before. You can actually see this object descending through cloud layers in that you can see cloud move in front and then behind this object as it's descending. It suggests that it's at quite a high altitude, thousands of feet, but at the same time, it's making some descent.
And what was it that caught their attention about it that they thought maybe it was a plane in trouble at first?
I think as they described it to me, it was the unusual motion, the fact that something was moving in the sky in a very odd corkscrew motion.
And if it were a plane in trouble in that kind of motion, you would think that would be linked to a crash.
Absolutely, and we have no record, no report of any crash at all. One would think that we would have heard of something by then.
Yeah, and did Marie and her husband, did they have a sense of how long they watched the white object doing the corkscrew motion down through the clouds before they saw the first hint of black?
They said that they had watched it for at least 5 or 10 minutes before it began making the black smoke. A very, very long time. So it was, moving at a high altitude away from them and then began giving off the black smoke. They did talk to Transport Canada. They contacted the officials themselves. The officials that they spoke with had no explanation. And since then, some of the local media, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, had also contacted some experts, some weather officials and government officials, and at this time, none of the officials that they've spoken with had an explanation as to what was seen.
And I read on January 3rd what the CBC News in Canada had reported on their website that included this quote from Marie Ford Quigley that so far the best explanation is that this might have been fuel dropped from an aircraft. And then it goes on to explain that sometimes if planes, a jet for example, were in trouble, it would try to get rid of its heavy fuel. And I'm curious if a terrestrial jet trying to get rid of fuel, wouldn't it all happen faster than this long 30-minute sequence?
Absolutely, and this is one of the big problems with that explanation is that it certainly wouldn't take that long to burn up. It would be something that would disperse rather quickly. Other explanations that have been put forward is that perhaps it was the reentry of a secret government rocket that had some problems and exploded on reentry. We do know that on December 10th, the National Reconnaissance Office did have a rocket explode as it was going into orbit, but of course this was a few weeks after that, so that's definitely not this object.
Right.
It's possible that there was another secret launch that had gone awry, but at this point we simply don't have any information that this would have occurred.
Have either you or Mr. and Mrs. Ford Quigley talked with anybody off the record in Canadian military or government who has tried to suggest any other knowledge?
We've made contact. I have spoken with people in the aviation industry through Transport Canada if they had any other records. I know that just a few days earlier than this, there was yet another sighting by a helicopter pilot not far from there, near Halifax in Nova Scotia, of an unusual object. And this pilot had spoken with somebody on the ground when he landed, who then contacted NORAD, and NORAD had actually admitted that they had tracked not only the helicopter, but this UFO, which was seen near the helicopter, and they had no idea what it was. We do have some contact that allows us to have some input from officials, and we're pursuing that as well. At this point, NORAD has not said anything about this particular, the smoke trail incident anyway.
Did NORAD use the phrase, the unidentified flying object, that they were tracking it?
It was an unidentified object, yes.
In the CBC website, they had another sidebar story that said that Canada seems to be exploding with unidentified flying objects in the sky. Would you give a kind of overview of what has been happening in the last month or two in Canada?
Well, we certainly have had a number of very unusual reports. In fact, just over the past couple of days, I've received 2 additional UFO reports from December, one from a place called Lake Audie, which is in northern Manitoba, and one from further north, up near the Arctic Circle, as a matter of fact, from somebody who had seen some unusual light. And as research coordinator for ufology research, we do the analysis and try and keep track of all the UFO reports made in Canada throughout the course of the year. And we're in the process of compiling all the reports together into our database, but at last count, we had more than 650 UFO reports in Canada for 2007 alone. But I do receive official UFO reports from Transport Canada and from the National Defence. I do get reports from Air Force bases, Canadian Force bases, regarding calls and reports that are made to them, but also from pilots and Air Force and Armed Forces personnel that they receive. I suspect, though, that I only get the tip of the iceberg because my classification is certainly not as high as I'd like it to be. So I would suspect that there's a great number of UFO reports at a much higher classification level than I'm privy to that are being made, and where those are going, I'm not sure.
Hopefully, the other eyewitnesses might be able to add some more dimension and depth to the eyewitness accounts, and eventually maybe we'll get an answer to what this strange dark spiral that lasted for 20 minutes of a 30-minute sighting that began with an oval white disc-looking aerial object with some kind of a strange tail. And the length of this sighting alone is so long, and the fact that there was never any crash reported, Whitley, makes this in a category of what Chris Fratowski says is high strangeness in Canada. And another interesting footnote about Prince Edward Island. It's out there off the east coast of Canada, right on the ocean, and it is one of the places in Canada where there have been crop formations. And in fact, in August 1999 and then again in 2002, it has had crop formations in blueberries. The one in 1999 was 18 feet in diameter and 12 feet in diameter in blueberries, and the people who were there and investigated said to place those kinds of circles down in blueberries the way that they were added that next dimension in crop circles that nobody was there with feed or boards cropping down those blueberries. Now, one other...
Linda, it's explained, obviously using canoes.
Yeah, right. It's like the rice paddies in Japan that are underwater with very complicated crop formations in them. But one other just final note for Dreamland and Earth Files viewers and listeners. Many people on the Internet keep discussing rumors that our entire solar system is warming up, causing thaws on Mars and out as far as Pluto. But Dr. Hathaway at NASA says there is no hard data that shows that our sun is so much brighter and hotter now that it would cause solar system-wide warming. In fact, even when the sun is at solar maximum with nearly 100 sunspots all over it, which would be really intense, the sun's brightness might increase only 1/1000th above its normal brightness during solar minimum, and even trying to measure that is a challenge to modern-day astrophysics.
Well, you know, also the mayhem that's going on in this planet right now, on Earth, I mean, in terms of weather, is extraordinary. We're having one of the most extraordinary winters in history.
Right.
Right as I speak today, there are massive floods in Africa. Central Asia is in a record-breaking deep freeze in an area that's already darn cold in the winter. The United States has been enduring a harsh, harsh winter. So has Canada. So has Europe. So, and yet today, to give you an example, it's record-breaking heat in New York right now. So, what do you think? I mean, what a wild world.
Yes, and this week, because of all of those extraordinary and destructive tornadoes in the Midwest in January, early January, I called Dr. Gerlach, who is one of the scientists, NASA scientists on Wallops Island off of Virginia. And that is a complete 100% NASA facility. And I asked him what his perception was as a meteorologist and somebody constantly studying with satellites what's happening to weather. Is a series of tornadoes in the Midwest of North America or the United States, is that unusual? And you know what he said to me? He said, Linda, it is unprecedented. That what is happening is consistent with the computer model projections that as global warming continued to take hold of the Earth because of the greenhouse gas blanket thickening, not because of any necessary increase in solar output, but just back to Earth activities, that we will see increasing pendulum swings of severity, that drought and floods will be juxtaposed to each other exactly as it has been in Georgia and then further north, floods or wherever the direction is. And right now, to hear a man on Wallops Island, one of the more critical scientific, you might say, they do a lot of things there with rocket sounding and satellites, to tell me that tornadoes, like we just have had in the first week of January 2008, is unprecedented. We really are in what everybody said in the science world that the computers were showing. We're going to have unparalleled, unprecedented wind, water, drought, floods, and this is, I'm sorry, but I think 2008 to 2009 is going to continue to unfold in dramatic ways. And, and you know who's quaking in the wings? The insurance companies.
Yes.
And behind them, our government.
That's right. Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for a very provocative report. As always, I frankly can hardly wait until next week. And next week on Dreamland, get ready for it. Our prophet's back. It's time to listen up to John Hogue and see what he has to say about 2008. Then in July, if we're still around, we'll hold his feet.
Years being in Dallas. So that's where our home is right now.
Well, you remind me of the bumper sticker said, I was not born in Texas, but I got here as quick as I could. And you're welcome to be here, and I'm glad to have somebody of your caliber in this area. Before we jump into some of the really interesting narratives of your book, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, let me start off by asking you, Nick, because I've known you for your diligent research into UFOs and into government documents, into, things that seem to be pretty solid. What was it that stirred you to go in search of monsters?
Well, actually, it goes back quite a long time. I mean, I'm 42 now, and my interest actually went back to when I was about 5 years old, around about 1969, and my parents took me to Loch Ness. And, of course, we all know what's alleged to live in Loch Ness, the Loch Ness Monster. And, even at that age, when my parents, or my father specifically, I think it was, told me that the tale of, how there was this supposedly still living dinosaur or some sort of weird creature lurking deep within Loch Ness, that really, even at that age, spurred my interest in weird phenomena, shall we say. And I guess, the idea of this spooky, large, fog-shrouded loch, the idea that this creature could exist in there, got me interested. And I suppose when a lot of the other kids at school were reading British equivalents of things like the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries, I was reading about Bigfoot, werewolves, and lake monsters. And I think that's really what kicked off my interest, was that defining moment of going to Loch Ness. And ever since then, really, my twin passions as far as the unexplained are concerned have been UFOs and weird creatures.
One thing tends to lead to another. Well, let me ask you, based on your research, too, what are your personal thoughts on the Loch Ness Monster? What's happening here?
Well, you know, a lot of people who are openly skeptical of the subject often make comments like, well, Britain's not a very big country. The entire nation is actually smaller than the state of Texas. And people say, well, how could something like the Loch Ness Monster remain hidden in Loch Ness and not be found, or discovered or at least determined what it is? People don't necessarily realize until they get there exactly how big Loch Ness is. I mean, it's 22 miles long, a mile wide. At its deepest point, it's almost 1,000 feet deep. And the water is literally pitch black. I think in many cases, the most unfortunate thing is that it's going to take a body to actually prove it. And, I'd hate for us to get the proof by having to kill one of these things. I would much prefer it if we could secure undeniable film footage or something like that. Or possibly, if it was a creature that wasn't that difficult to catch, catch it, tag it, and then let it go. But I have a nagging suspicion that if we ever prove these things really exist, it's going to come by, somebody actually killing one and it being autopsied. But, that's just one of the unfortunate hazards. Mm-hmm.
Maybe not even then, because I recall a few years ago, and I think Whitley was involved in this, they found what they thought was the body of one of the chupacabras here in Texas, and yet there they had physical evidence in their hands, and yet there was an argument over what it was, and most people never even heard of that story. Well, Nick, moving on from Loch Ness, let's get back to your 5-year journey into mystery and intrigue and these fabulous monsters. What was the one case that you've investigated that struck you as being very well-founded in fact and documentation?
Okay. Well, just to give people background, the book basically it's kind of like written in a first-person road trip format, and it begins with me moving to the US in the summer of 2001, and then goes on to the summer of 2006 when we moved back to England for a year. And basically, it covers a whole range of weird creatures, or cryptids as they're commonly known. Everything from lake monsters, Bigfoot, werewolf encounters even, the chupacabras, and a variety of other lesser well-known creatures around the United States. And basically, I traveled around road trip style, investigating these things and interviewing the witnesses. I would have to say that probably the most impressive collective body of testimony that I found came during the course of my two expeditions to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabras that you referred to earlier. Now, I'm sure everybody listening to the show has heard of the chupacabras of Puerto Rico, this strange, I guess almost vampire-like creature that reportedly or reputedly lives on the blood of the local animal population. And, we've read about the reports, seen the articles in the magazines and the newspapers, etc. But for me, at least, I only began to appreciate the sheer scale and seriousness of the subject. And so, the idea that if this creature is a water breather or derives its oxygen from the water, it's water breathing, it may very well hardly ever need to surface. And so, the idea that a colony of creatures, maybe anywhere from sort of 10 to 25 feet in length, could actually hide out there and not be found actually isn't implausible. And of course, if they are predominantly water-living creatures, then when they die, they're just going to sink to the bottom of the loch. And bear in mind, as I said, 1,000-foot deep loch with pitch-black water, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually find one of these creatures unless we actually catch it in the act, sort of basking on the shore or something, which, granted, there have been a few reports along those lines decades ago, but certainly nothing in recent years. So, I think that explains possibly why we haven't caught the thing. Now, as far as what it is, that's a different matter entirely. There's no doubt that up until the last ice age, Loch Ness was open to the oceans, and then it became landlocked when the ice came down and basically, covered the exit points. And some people have suggested that may well have meant that creatures that possibly, were indigenous to the oceans, if you like, made their way in there and adapted to living in a freshwater environment. One of the theories that's often put forward is a plesiosaur, a still living dinosaur. Other people have suggested, by definition, monstrous size eels. Other people have suggested that maybe it's a creature that science hasn't even classified yet, that, it doesn't belong to a known type of animal, whether extinct or not. The best that I can say is that I'm convinced that something lives in Loch Ness, a colony of some sort of creature that predominantly is water-based, but occasionally appears to come out on the land, particularly at night, although there haven't, as I said, been many of these reports, if any, for decades, but certainly there was a proliferation in the 30s and 40s of people seeing this large neck creature sort of basking on the shore late at night, or even crossing the road in one of two cases and lit up by the headlamps of motorbikes and cars. I think, that's about as much as I can say in terms of what it may be. I think it's there. I'm just not entirely sure what it is.
Right. Well, and I guess we won't be sure until somebody catches one or gets a very clear photograph. So from Loch Ness,
right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that unfortunately, although I'd like to get the answers to what a lot of these mystery animals are.
Got a very exciting show, Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, a 5-year journey in search of the unknown, a wild story from Nick Redfern, and Jim Mars is fascinated with it, which is why in a couple of minutes he's going to be interviewing Nick. For our subscribers, I'm going to be talking to Nick also about a sighting of an enormous bird I had in Coscob, Connecticut in 1979 while outdoors with my little then newborn child. A harrowing experience I have never forgotten. Nick knows a lot about this and what happened and what it may have meant. Here on Dreamland, in a couple of minutes, Jim is going to be talking to Nick Redfern about monster hunting. Now, before he does that, there are some terrific things you need to know about this book. Like one of our frequent Dreamland guests, Marie Jones, author of Science and Supervolcano, says Memoirs of a Monster Hunter is a wild and woolly 5-year odyssey into the unknown, courtesy of one of the premier investigative researchers and authors in the field. And that is so true. Having had the pleasure of interviewing Nick before, I am excited. This is going to be a terrific experience. Nick is a full-time author and journalist. He specializes in unsolved mysteries, monsters, alien abductions, government conspiracies. He writes for the Daily Express in England. He writes for the Fortean Times, Fate, for UFO magazines. His previous books, Strange Secrets, Cosmic Crashes, which I believe we talked about on Dreamland, Three Men Seeking Monsters. So I would like to welcome what I think is going to be a phenomenal interview with guest host Jim Mars and Dreamland guest Nick Redfern. Gentlemen, welcome both of you to Dreamland. How are you doing, Jim?
Thank you, Whitley. Yes, I'm looking forward to this discussion with Nick Redfern because I've known Nick for some time now and know him to be a responsible and dedicated researcher. Nick, it's great to have you with us today. You're speaking from your new home in Dallas, right?
That's right, Jim, and thanks for that introduction, Whitley. That's very much appreciated. That's right. Excuse me. I've been in the U.S. for 6 years and in Texas throughout that entire period. My wife's from just outside the town of Beaumont, and we originally lived just outside Houston and been back and forth. And the last couple of when I actually got out there, I've done 2 expeditions to Puerto Rico, each for several weeks at a time. And the most recent one a week at a time. And what I found was that there's a great deal of interest, belief, and superstition surrounding the chupacabras. It's taken very, very seriously, not just by the islanders, but also by the local civil defense people who actively investigate these reports if ranchers and farmers report the incidents to them. They almost have like a rapid response team, I guess is the best way to describe it, who go out there and collect the animals, autopsy them, and try and determine what happened. And I think it was the chupacabras more than anything else, which was the one case that was, for me, was almost like, wow, there's no doubt this thing exists. I spoke with a number of highly credible witnesses who told me very interesting and impressive stories about encountering the chupacabras, quite literally up close and personal. And basically, we can talk about some of those stories, some of those cases, and, get into what the witnesses told me.
Okay, well, let's do that right after we take this break. And this is your host, Jim Mars. We're on Dreamland, and we're speaking with Nick Redfern, and we'll be right back after this.
Later on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe has a report about that bizarre smoke cloud that was seen in Canada last week. What were the objects that were observed before the smoke cloud appeared? Was this an Atlas rocket, as NASA suspects, or was it something very, very different? We'll find out in the Linda Moulton Howe segment at the end of the show. Subscribers, did you know that you can get The Path and the Key together for $11 off or $5 off each book? Just use the coupon in the subscriber section to get your copy of The Path and the Key.
Howdy, it's Jim Mars, and we're back here on Dreamland with Nick Redfern. We're talking about cryptids, or to the uninitiated, monsters. And we've been talking, he said that the most documented cases that he has found has to do with the chupacabra, the goat sucker. And he's made several trips to Puerto Rico. But, Nick, I know there's also been reports in Mexico and Texas, so that leads me to believe that we're not just talking about one monster, are we?